Hi everyone, my name is Maya and I'm speaking today as an expert in content moderation and trust and safety. Most recently I was the operations manager for the trust and safety team at Vimeo. So I have a lot to say about this topic and I'm really excited to get going. So what was the first question?
What's the problem that you're trying to solve?
So I think when you talk about content moderation and trust and safety, the larger question and problem that you're trying to solve for is how to create an internet that protects and enhances freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but one that also does not allow the content and the information that's being circulated to harm our democracies or our communities or even ourselves. And that can be in terms of physical well-being when we talk about like anti-vax content, or of course mental well-being, emotional well-being.
Hey everyone, I'm Dustin Patton. I'm an associate professor of social work, sociology, and data science at Columbia University. For the past 6 years, I've been studying the role of social media in gun violence, and I have one critical problem. We understand that social media, text, images can have an impact on what's happening offline in low-income communities of color. We hear from violence outreach workers and moms and dads who tell us that the things that are being said online are having a direct impact in shootings and deaths. But on the other end, we also know that that same text, those same images can be used against their kids, can be used as negative character testimony or evidence in legal proceedings as well. And so I have this conundrum with how do we leverage social media and artificial intelligence to understand this problem of gun violence, and who gets to decide the ethics of doing this work as well. And so in my lab, the SAFE lab, we use artificial intelligence, in particular machine learning and computer vision, to understand root causes of community violence. But more importantly, we hire young people as domain experts. So not ethicists, not technologists, but young people who live in the communities where the social media data comes from, to help us understand not only how to translate and interpret culture, context, and nuance in data, but to understand the larger impact of these systems in their communities.
Hi everyone, my name is Ginny Foz, and the problem I'm trying to solve is that tech is not built by everyone, nor is it built for everyone. And I currently wear two hats. One of the hats is working on tech is not built by everyone. I run a nonprofit called Venture Moving Forward, and we work with VC firms and encourage them to publish policies about harassment and discrimination and how those behaviors will be handled at their firm if they are to occur between a VC and a potential entrepreneur. And the purpose of publishing policies is such that entrepreneurs of many different backgrounds are protected when they go to raise capital. So this initiative is about how do we increase diversity in entrepreneurship and make sure that more types of people are able to secure funding to start businesses. On the side of tech is not built for everyone. I'm currently a fellow at the Aspen Institute's Tech Policy Hub. We are a tech policy program teaching career technologists, my background is in software engineering, to engage in the policy process. And as a fellow there, I'm working on making sure that vulnerable populations are able to access government services. And specifically, I've been working to help older adults access services for reporting online scams and fraud that happen to them to the government.
Great. We wanted to sort of take our big theme areas and make them sort of smaller and tangible. Can you talk about an example of how your work might sort of impact an individual?
So in my lab, we've been focused on one person for 6 years. We've been studying a young woman named Jakira Barnes who was murdered in 2014, just steps from her house. And the headlines about her life read, "The gun-toting gang girl of Chicago." So this idea is that she was like Little Snoop from The Wire. She was an enforcer, she was tough, you didn't mess with her, and by the time she was 17 years old, she had allegedly shot or killed up to 17 people. And so in our initial analysis, we were actually looking for forms of retaliation that may be shaped by her Twitter conversations. But we were imbibing these negative views about young black kids initially. We weren't thinking about her as a whole person, as a young black girl. We were thinking about her as this violent, gun-toting gang girl. But what she did is that she became my teacher, and she actually showed us that she's a whole person, that she loved, that she cared, that she had deep trauma and pain that affected her day in and day out. And she leveraged Twitter to be hyper vulnerable, to be hyper critical about the life that she was living. And so she forced us to understand that this platform is more than just a platform for communication, but a way of coping and getting support for her life more generally. And so I think that what we've learned is that social media, the narrative on social media is typically fairly narrative, but for young people who live in communities with high rates of community violence, it could also be the thing that helps them get to the next day.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. So an individual that I'm working with and helping to solve problems for, one of the philosophies that my team of fellows and I are bringing to our project to protect older adults in their online interactions is this philosophy of user-centered design. The idea of being it's really important to spend time with the people you're building products for, right? And so we've hosted design thinking workshops in San Francisco with partnering with local senior centers and inviting older adults in and asking them to talk about what are their experiences like online. And you hear amazing stuff. You hear, oh, I love being able to use the internet to look at Google Earth. And my brother lives in Thailand. I'll never be able to travel there to visit, and I get to see his apartment from Google Earth. And so obviously all of us get so many benefits from being online, and older adults too are having a ton of fun and finding new music and meeting people through games they play, et cetera. And then we've asked them to talk about times when they're frustrated online. And actually we've conducted a bunch of user research with older adults testing government forms that are built for them. So we're working with the FBI as well as the FTC and testing forms that these agencies have for older adults to report scams and fraud that happen to them. And so you'll sit down with an older adult and they're going through the form as if they need to report something to the government. And the way the form is designed, there's these full color sections and then these kind of grayed out sections. And the idea is if the section's grayed out, you don't have to fill it in, right? That's a design language that many of us in this room would be familiar with, of like, oh, if something's grayed out, then it's not required. But for older adults, the text is really small, so it's already really hard to see, and the distinction between grayed out and full color is really challenging. And so an older adult who I was working with as a user testing moment of trying to fill out this form is clicking into this grayed out section. And clicking and starting like button mash and like really click, and the browser's flying like out to the other side of the screen, and then it takes a whole effort to get it back, and he clicked on this grayed out section for 45 seconds and then stood up and said, I don't want to do this exercise, I'm done. And the takeaway here is that simple design elements of government services are losing people from getting service delivery that they deserve, and people who don't have access to their own computers, who didn't grow up with the internet, are being left behind. And so the research I'm doing is trying to get those folks in the room and connecting them with our colleagues in government agencies to make sure that we understand how digital services are being consumed by the people they're built for, and we're able to improve the design such that people are actually able to use the services they need.
And Ginny, can you tell us a little bit about the feedback loop that helps take this information from a focus group back into government?
Yeah, and that's the policy side of what I'm working on right now. The user testing such as this is really popular within tech companies, and those of you who work in industry are probably familiar with it, or some of you may have attended a design thinking workshop. And it's a lot harder to make part of process in government because there are so many rules and regulations and systems that are built up that don't include it. So a lot of what we're doing is creating reports and video clips and interactive presentations that show, audio clips where our officials are working with the FBI and FTC can listen to what it's like for people to test their forms. And government teams are making more of an effort right now to build user testing into the way that they design their digital interfaces. And there are certain groups within government that have been very early adopters and very effective in improving services by involving users more quickly. But we're currently working on a very specific problem with a very specific population and trying to bridge that the communication gap between the people using the services and the officials building them.
Thanks. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about an individual impacted by the work?
I think in my space, the individual that we're most concerned with is obviously our user base. And the idea is obviously people use the internet to find things. And you have a certain expectation when you're going on the internet that you will find exactly what you want and nothing else. So the work that I do is really weeding out the content that people don't want to see or shouldn't see or is just generally bad for society and surfacing the stuff that people are really looking for.
And who gets to decide what someone shouldn't see?
That's like an ongoing question and answer that we're constantly working on and currently tweaking. And it is really hard to draw those lines, especially when you consider the cultural context of something. If you're an international platform, what is okay here might be considered censorship somewhere else. So, we have a basic guideline across multiple platforms, which is like, be good, don't scam people, like just be a decent person on the internet. But from there, you really have to drive down deeper. And I think what that looks like is constant reiteration of that and evaluating what's happening in society and understanding what we need to do to keep up.
And we heard in an earlier panel about sort of tech regulation. Do you think there's a role for regulation in that process?
Yes, I do. I think we cannot really necessarily rely on private entities to kind of be the judge, jury, and executioner of what is and is not okay. And the reason that I feel that way is because, as she mentioned, tech is not built by everyone, and so it's not representative of everyone. And so we couldn't possibly understand every single aspect of society in order to make these decisions. So really, I think that the solution here is a societal change and that the government needs to evolve. We need to have also individuals get more like awareness around media literacy and kind of understanding what to expect from the internet and what to parse out from good to bad. And then of course have tech involved as well to surface that information appropriately.
Which is a little bit of an echo of the last lightning talk, this idea about fairness. Do you guys see that principle playing out in the work that you're doing?
For me, I think it depends who you ask. So at Vimeo, we recently made a policy against anti-vax content, or anti-vaccination content. And the reason for that was we decided that that was a public health issue and that that kind of content would be detrimental to society. But of course, there's people that are on that side of the camp and definitely did not agree with that, and they felt that our policy was unfair. So really, I think at the end of the day, there's no way to kind of appease everyone. It's a tough thing.
I don't know what fairness means within the context of life and death decisions, right? And so I'm always really confused by tech conversations around ethics and fairness that don't really, as we heard earlier, really hit at these lived realities, right? And so on one end, like, do I tell a mom who just recently lost a kid because of something they said on social media that led to gun violence, and I say, well, we could have used artificial intelligence to identify some patterns, but it's unethical to do that. So I'm sorry you lost your child. Or we use the tool, and that same tool then leads to their child being arrested 6 months later or a year later because police have been surveilling them based on some language. And so who gets to decide what's fair? Do I, as a social worker, does the mom who lost their kid, do the police officers? And so I am interested in a more robust understanding of fairness that goes beyond what ethicists say or what technologists believe, but is really rooted in community values. And a part of the problem is that we just don't have enough of those folks involved, right? So we keep talking about folks who are not involved and not here. And so there probably aren't a lot of community members from the communities that I work in this particular space. And so how do we actually create pipelines so that people can actually be a part of the decision-making process and stop talking about it and doing this low-touch thing where we're going to hire a Black person, hire a Latino person, and then all is good. Like, what does it actually look like to create these spaces so that people can not just be a part of it, but thrive in those spaces too? So that's a long answer around fairness, but I think it's super complicated.
How do you think that we craft those spaces so that different stakeholders feel comfortable?
You know, a part of what we have been doing is just trying to be in partnership in that space, right? And so as a social worker, I understand that it's not my choice to make decisions for people, but to work alongside with them. And that has been really useful. So we work with the Brownsville Community Justice Center, and we work with their young people, and they have really been so eye-opening and help us to understand the impact of tech in their life. And one of the things we've learned from those young people is that, you know, if you can use surveillance to keep me safe, to keep creepy adults out of my social media so I can stay safe, they're all for that. But if you use it and you misinterpret what they say and use it against them, they're not against that. That's really important and critical information for developing the technology that actually keeps them safe.
Mm-hmm. And I would ask you the same question that we had for Ginny. What's the feedback loop that takes that information back into, we heard from Tumblr this morning or about Facebook, that takes that back into like a platform?
Right, so what we've done is, with those young people, we've created a simulation called Interpret Beam. And it's really, really connected to the work that you're doing. And so the point is, what we understand is that there's a lot of misinterpretation happening in social media analysis. And what the young people at Brownsville did is that they helped us to create a platform that doesn't help you interpret better, but it forces you to reckon with your own bias. And so you get a chance to think about the biases that are in your interpretation, and then you get a chance to get more context around that particular post, and then you're asked to make a decision around how you would use that social media post for change. And the goal is to hopefully induce, for content moderators and for others who may be applying social media, a moment to pause and think about what you're doing and how you're interpreting, but also a way to think about digital restorative practices in which lends themselves to less punitive reactions and more restorative practices that give people opportunities for change.
Is that tool up and live?
So we have a prototype, and our young people are refining it, and we're going to do some user testing around it, and we will hopefully be deploying it sometime next semester.
It's actually really interesting you bring up the idea of a tool that can help you pause, because something we've been hearing a lot from older adults we've been speaking to in our research is, I know that things happen really quickly online, and I wish there were tools and systems that could help me pause and get help about whether content I see is authentic, about where it's coming from, etc. There's a lot of research out there about how older adults are more likely to spread misinformation online, and a lot of that is actually neurobiological. There are things that happen in the brain as we age such that we see the positives and not the negatives of things. We are less quick to question evidence. And people are aware of those changes in themselves and have been asking for tools to help pause. And so I think it's really cool that you're building a version of that.
That's great. So turning sort of left a little bit, what do you think is misunderstood about the work that you're doing? Maya.
I think the biggest misunderstanding is that this is a problem that needs to be solved either by tech or by government, or maybe both. And really, I think what we need, again, is a societal shift. We need to kind of keep having these conversations. And that's exactly why this kind of thing that we're all at today is very important, because we really need to come together as a society and really decide what we want from the internet and what kind of experience we want to create together. So yeah, I think the misunderstanding is that someone else will fix it, when really we should all be doing it together.
I think for me, the biggest misconception is that I'm interested in prediction and surveillance. And those have been terms that I think I've wrestled with for the past 6 years in this research. Are we predicting, or is there surveillance? And where I've netted out is that we're really interested in assessment, right? We're really interested in understanding, like, how do we leverage social media as a neighborhood, as a community, as an ecology that should be treated the same way we treat physical neighborhoods, to help us understand root causes to violence in ways that we may not get through traditional forms of surveys or even qualitative methods. Because what we're learning is that we're able to see a multiplicity of selves online. We see a performative self, a school self, a tough self, and all of those become important data points for understanding how and why we see the types of communications that we see. And that would be really hard to get via a survey. And so, yeah, I think that we're trying to push back against this idea that we're interested in prediction and really interested in biopsychosocial assessments.
I think a big misunderstanding is that government doesn't care about improving its technology. Through collaborating with a number of government agencies, there are very motivated, very bright, very excitable and hardworking folks who are working to improve government digital services, and there are actually a number of new groups in government with career technologists joining in increasing rates that are trying to work on this. And government is just, it's a huge machine and hard to steer its course in a new direction, but I think a lot of us get impressions about what the government knows about tech from hearings with Mark Zuckerberg, where people are, or moments when a senator asks the Google CEO to fix his iPhone and things like that. And there are people who are very behind, but there are also a lot of folks working in government who are extremely talented and eager to upgrade the digital services we have as a country.
Is there ways, do you think, that government could make a better case or make itself more attractive, right? There's competing priorities if you think about young people coming out of school, right? Government, I'm going to laugh and be a little sarcastic, and innovation don't always go together, right? How can we make those kinds of roles more attractive or possibly competitive?
One of there are a few programs that I think are doing really interesting work here. There's a group called the U.S. Digital Service, which is an internal consultancy within the U.S. government for career technologists who would like to do a tour of duty to serve their country. So it's a program that takes people from top tech companies, and you have either 2 or 4 years, you have a set term for which you are serving the government with your technology skills. I think programs like that are really motivating because there are a lot of people with technology skills who care about serving broader society than any private corporation allows them to, but also don't want to transition to the government for life. And so I think programs like that are really effective. And I know Travis Moore is here somewhere, but he runs an amazing program, the Tech Congress Fellows Program, which enables technologists to work on the Hill in various senators' offices, et cetera. And I think programs like that also help raise awareness in the technology community of all of the opportunities in government and the ways that you could plug in and use your skills to serve a broader society than any corporation would enable.
Do you think that the private sector should be doing a better job or a different job supporting these government innovations?
I think we need more government R&D funding. I think that a lot of the most essential technologies, GPS technology, the foundations of the internet, all of the huge technological advances that private corporations build their companies off of came from came from government research initially, and that funding has been sliced and sliced and sliced and sliced. So that's a higher priority to me.
Got it. So before we open it up to questions, because we wanted to let you guys ask a lot of questions, what's the one thing, because we're coming from such disparate sectors, what's the one thing that someone could take away today and do or implement in their sort of sphere that would work to empower themselves in this digital landscape?
I need a second, so someone has to go first.
I read a stat this week that only 17% of Americans believe technology policy is important. Believe that having our government elected officials thinking about and working on bills and initiatives that address technology and its ethics and development is something worthy of supporting. And so to me, that is a call to action to the folks in this room who are passionate about this, to talk to our families and communities who maybe don't work in industry or aren't in our grad school programs or whatever, because even some of my closest friends from high school and closest friends in life say, oh, I don't care about my digital privacy. Already Google knows everything about me, so I'm not going to use a different browser. I'm not going to, not use a public Wi-Fi network. People don't believe in protecting their privacy because they believe it's futile, and also don't even feel as if it's possible. And I think that's on us to preach the importance of maintaining autonomy and privacy in this age of increasing surveillance, and to talk with those we love and care about that.
I think it's important that we all be reading outside of our respective disciplines or areas of work, right? So there are a lot of conversations around the impact of technologies, particularly in marginalized spaces that are not coming to the forefront of a lot of these discussions. And oftentimes we're just not reading outside of the space. You know, reading work from sociologists and social workers and developing critical partnerships with folks outside of these spaces. I can't underscore enough that one of the things that I have kind of become more, that's raised to the top of my thinking is that, you know, because I'm not a technologist, I didn't consider myself to be important to the conversation, and I think that was wrong. I think that my access, my use, my breathing is all a part of a tech generation that I think that we should all consider and think as an important contribution to tech development as well.
So I would imagine that most of us here, I could be wrong, are not connected to a university or want to go back and look up academic journals. Are there pop channels that might be useful in that regard?
What do you mean by pop channels?
So non-academic journal literature that might give you access to how tech is impacting marginalized communities.
Probably, can't think of them off the top of my head. Who I'm in love with right now is Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology. That book is changing my life. It's changing how I think about race as productive, race as a technology. So I would say that book, and also I'm pairing it with Ethical Algorithm, which I just picked up recently too. And so reading those two books simultaneously is radically changing my life. So I like those two books.
Sorry, what are we doing?
So when someone walks out the door, what's something they can do in the content moderation arena to sort of empower themselves?
So again, I'd kind of like to mimic what she was mentioning, and I think we need to like really have a societal shift, and you need to talk to your friends and neighbors and family and people that are probably less educated in tech and really help them understand what could be considered misinformation versus what's real, and really helping people better understand for themselves what they can rely on and what they shouldn't rely on. And I think that's important because right now we're relying on tech companies and private organizations to make these decisions, and like I've mentioned before, they're not well suited for that, and it's not sustainable. So I think bringing awareness to the people around you and to keep having these conversations and really pushing your local officials and everything to really understand that tech policy is crucial and it matters, and I think it's long overdue.
Thanks. So we wanted to open it up for questions. We have 3 really distinct areas of interest and study. Really distinct. Yeah, please.
I'm so glad that we're focusing on the human part of human and tech. I'm from a psychological background, and I'm a college professor. I've been on the front line in my classroom in 2006 because you had to have a .edu to have Facebook, right? And so my classes turned into 3 hours of Facebook therapy in 2006, which got me on the path of digital socialization, how it's being shaped. One of the things, and you really hit on it, we don't have the problem in this room about passion of educating us on this topic. You were saying the same thing. How do we get that that shift, the cultural shift? I feel like our biggest challenge is this intersection between apathy and greed. And so we have this extremely apathetic, and from the psychological standpoint, right, with addiction, we know if there's something that you love, nobody wants to hear that the thing that they love isn't good for them. So how might we, to use your design thinking terminology, how might we make this attention to your privacy, to how it's shaping us, how might we make that a cool thing? I always want to start a trend because it's the fastest form of change. How might we make this a trend that protecting your privacy is a cool thing to do? I'm glad you have all the answers. I'm so happy.
Go, Jenny.
I'll start by saying, yeah. I think there are two parts of that. So there's the part about how do we help individuals notice the ways technology is shaping them. Because once they notice that, perhaps they'll want to change their technology use. And I can give a personal anecdote for some of what's motivated me to change my ways. I used to be very much a Facebook addict. Like I was probably 3 or 4 hours a day on Facebook 5 years ago. And I had my closest friend from college, we were talking on the phone one day, and she said to me, you know, every time we've spoken this year, you've mentioned a time that Facebook made you feel sad about something. And she just said that, and the conversation continued. But after the phone call, I was like, wow, this is affecting my friendships. This is what I'm talking about with my friends, is the sadness I'm feeling from how much time I'm spending here. And it was a catalyst to, honestly, all I did was delete Facebook from my phone. Like, I'm still on there, but because it's not on my phone, I probably look once a week now, maybe. And it's a small lifestyle change, right? Like, deleting an app on a phone takes 1 second. And then, over a few weeks, my use was significantly lower. And then I think there are a lot of small lifestyle things we can do to really cut down on the control that these platforms have over our psyches and emotions and self-worth and all these things. But I think there's immense power in having it start from someone close to you making observations. As far as how you make that cool, it feels more grassroots to me than viral.
Yeah.
Like if it's viral, then it's the people who are on the platform, right? Like it needs to be more grassroots than that, and about similarly having conversations with the people in your life around you. I just feel better. Like I feel so much better now. So that's cool. And then I tell people in my life that this happened and I feel better. But I don't know if there's a way to have a mass moment of popularity, because so much of the ways popularity is seated in our culture right now are through these same platforms that would need to be combated.
I think you would maybe need to have some celebrities.
I always use the kale, the kale model.
Young people.
It's like, why is everyone eating a kale salad today? Like one celebrity ended up doing it, now all of a sudden, it's like if we had people being off, boundaries or healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
Cool.
But I'm wondering, how do we also open this up a little bit to contend with the fact that thinking about privacy, considering privacy is also a privilege and a luxury, right? And so in the communities that I work in, a lot of young people are highly curate their social media life and understand that some people may be watching them. They're fully aware. But being able to communicate stress and power and to reach out in spaces where you don't get that every day supersedes this idea that I need to be private. And so it's not to say that they shouldn't understand privacy or enact these strategies, but how do we open up the conception of privacy enough to include that privacy is not something that works for everybody at the same time and in the same moments too?
I think, so I also think that it would be really useful, so this is a little bit preaching to the choir, we're all here today because you're interested in sort of making an impact or having a community where you can talk about these things and not sound like a lunatic because you're using Brave or DuckDuckGo. And I think that it would open up the conversation if we could make tangible to people the notion that they're being commodified, right? That the business model under which these systems work is based on selling you things. And it's, I think, hard because we've glamorized in lots of ways Silicon Valley, and that's, again, a broad brushstroke. But I think that I don't have a good answer for this, but I think it would be really useful to make tangible to just sort of people in the subway that when you sign on to NYC Wi-Fi, somebody's surveilling you, and that one, and two, that we don't have 100% control over where that data goes. And I think that those are really abstract ideas because you can't see your data and you can't put your data in your pocket. But to the degree that we can sort of show people where these things live, like there was a conversation, gosh, maybe 6 months ago, that Link NYC, right, those hubs that have popped up all over the place, that there's cameras in them. And it was shocking to me that people thought that was shocking, that there's, maybe you didn't know there was cameras in them. But that's a mechanism for surveilling and monitoring, right? And so you, frankly, like some of us may not think that's a big deal, right? But for others of us, that might really, there might be a real significant cost to that, your whereabouts being tracked. And so I think we need to do a better job about making that like present and real for people.
To me, there's a real place here for art. Someone earlier was talking about how they're an artist and technologist, and actually I saw a really impactful exhibit this summer. Has anyone in the room been to DEF CON before? Yeah, so there's a DEF CON. DEF CON is a security researchers conference that happens annually in Las Vegas. And I went for the first time this year, but there's an exhibit at DEF CON that is one of the more kind of famous elements of this conference, which is, it's called Wall of Sheep. And the Wall of Sheep is a large screen, and it tracks the public Wi-Fi network. And there's a group of hackers, like anyone who wants to, and a lot of security hackers and researchers are at this conference, so anyone who wants to can come and sit down and hack the public Wi-Fi network and publish all of the data about anybody using the public Wi-Fi on this huge screen.
That's great.
Yeah, so you walk in, and first of all, you just see, it's a dark room with everyone noodling on the computer, and like all the engineering terminals are out. And then you look up, and the data of all of these poor and suspecting individuals who are just hoping to have a nice weekend in Las Vegas is publicly available for everyone. And moments like that, I mean, I'm an engineer, I'm a software engineer, I know that public Wi-Fi is bad, and still it's so convenient, right? But I saw that exhibit, and now I don't do it. I'm like, I'll pay the extra data cost, I don't want my stuff out there. So I think there's an amazing role for art and expressions that help make tangible for those of us who have never hacked into a public Wi-Fi box, like how easy it is and what it looks like.
Yeah, please.
So when I was in college, I was involved in radical politics, and we spent a lot of time worrying about being infiltrated. And it was like really paranoid, and it's like really like a toxic culture to have, like worry that people are being infiltrated. Except like we worked closely with our Muslim Student Association, and years later, we found out that the NYPD had infiltrated MSAs at other nearby schools, not our school, but like other schools we had friends have. And so like the paranoia was justified. And the thing is that now it feels like we're doing that at scale. Like now we all get to be infiltrated, and that's just like normal. And instead of like trying to not be like that anymore, we're trying to like train people on how to like detect infiltration and how to like protect yourself against infiltration. And so my question is like, is there any hope? Like, can we make it better? Can we like not be like, can we not live like this anymore? Like, is there any way we can live in a world where like we don't like carefully cleanse our like social media identities and like I don't know, like it makes me sad. Like it makes me sad to live that way. And like the person sitting next to me is a public school teacher. And, like, it makes me even sadder to think that like the 14-year-olds who she teaches, like they are going to grow up living that way. And like surely we can make this better so that they don't. Like imagine living from 14 to 84 or whatever in that entire time. You're like living like this. Like it can't. Like we shouldn't let it go on. Is there any way we can not let it go on?
I think we're working on it. That's why we're here. We're working on that. Wait, we have an answer.
No, I actually have a question.
I think we're stumped, so we're going to move on to Ruben's question.
So I'd be curious to hear from Maya as well as others. So we kind of talked a lot about misaligned incentives, both from a personal engagement perspective as well as from a business perspective, right? Where it's like, okay, this is all about attention because we need the eyeballs, because we need the ads, because we need the dollars. What does it look like to grow the governance capacity inside an organization? What are some stories of how that looks like, and how can we, in our respective contexts, help to build more of that?
Can you expand on that?
So basically, you're probably seen as a cost within your organization. Like,
Absolutely,
we
yeah.
have to do this because, you know, otherwise we might get sued, blah, 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 blah. Like, how do we make that more of a, not just sort of like, okay, well, have to do, but like want to do and need to do inside of the organizations that we work inside of?
I think, again, it's about bringing awareness, and especially when you're talking about private entities, like PR is a very motivating factor for people, especially when they're trying to grow and make more profit. So whenever I'm asking for like a dev resource or something like that, I always have to kind of quantify in terms of dollar, like what this could potentially cost us if I don't do this. And a lot of times it'll be like in terms of loss of users. They'll come to our platform, see some pornography, see some extremist content, and leave. I think, I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I think we just have to kind of bring it to the surface more, and really, in one of the previous panels, they were talking about at Tumblr how they're prioritizing user safety at the beginning of making a product. And too often we see a product be made and then trust and safety aspects just pushed out afterwards, or maybe not even thought of at all. So we have to kind of build this into the core of our product and into the core of our experience as well.
I've thought about this issue from the angle of security and cybersecurity, which is another angle that is seen as a cost to organizations. What I think is important there is if regulators are requiring data from corporations about the numbers of hacks and scams and bad activity on platforms, and then they're publishing that data publicly so that journalists are getting all over it, the public's getting all over it, et cetera. I think one of the issues right now is we don't yet have government agencies requiring companies contributing this data to them, and thus we actually don't, like, as users with individual experiences on platforms, I don't know which of the platforms I use is really better or worse at cybersecurity. I don't know which ones are doing like better or worse at user-generated content, right? Like, or at content moderation. And from a single experience, it's really hard to get that overall look. But I think actually regulators are actively thinking and talking about how do we get this data contributed and then published, because then the companies are competing against each other's policies, right? Because it's like
information FDA, basically.
Of course we do. So right now, the FCC is devoting some resources to this, but you can imagine, so I say this with a little bit of trepidation, you can imagine under our present administration how those agencies are losing resources, and then where they have to prioritize things.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a component of the problem, but there was, maybe Mark Lanterno was talking about this in the global panel. There are human rights focused audits that an organization, a corporation could opt into and then make that information public, right? So if we think about how supply chain has become really part of the public consciousness around where you shop, right? And are things fair trade or ethical or not made by little kids either in the States or somewhere else, that if we as a public demand that there is some accountability for the tech ethics side or the human rights side of platforms and other technology vendors, then that changes the conversation a little bit, right? So we have some mechanisms for creating accountability. And the human rights audit is only one mechanism. There's ethics audits. There's lots of different standards that someone could use or a company could use. And to some degree, we have a lot of control over that, right? Like if you demand to understand what the ethical impact or the ethical footprint of, you're gonna laugh, at Facebook, then if as a sort of block, if people are asking for that and then leaving if they don't get it back, then that's one mechanism for moving that forward.
And Yael made this point earlier too when she was talking about how do we have transparency around the algorithms that dictate news feeds, sure. Right? It's another similar idea of like if you're publishing the ingredients that are going into your experience, then all of a sudden platforms are competing against each other to be more ethical to continue to have consumer trust.
So another question, I've been hearing a lot about responsibility around impacts of technology today, and I was wondering what you also saw the role of accountability in that, right? So if we come under the assumption that harm is not actually something that can be entirely mitigated, it's inevitable, how do you contend with the ways in which you need to be accountable in your various positions, and what are those mechanisms?
That's a tough one. I think in a lot of ways there should be some level of accountability because, for example, at Facebook, anytime you connect 2 billion people in the world, there's going to be some sort of impact from that. So there has to be some level of accountability, and I think this is why regulation is such a crucial topic right now, because it's not really enough to just kind of let private companies figure it out on their own, and we've seen that doesn't really work very well. But I also I think there's too much pressure on tech right now. There's a lot of slamming on tech and they don't get it, they're not doing anything. And it's, I think, a conversation that needs to happen on a lot of different levels with a lot of different people, and it's not just necessarily a tech problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm struggling because as you were talking, my initial gut reaction is like, it is a tech problem. And a part of the problem is that we have held tech to this idea that the things that they create we should use, how they think about problems we should take, and how they hold people accountable is okay, as opposed to interdisciplinary process, which would hopefully bring more people to the table with even creating and anticipating creating technologies, but also anticipating problems in the first place. So yeah, I'm struggling there a little bit, and with accountability, absolutely. But I'm also, before we even get to accountability, generally, what are our non-negotiables? Like, what should we not be doing in the first place? Where should we stop? Should we proceed? I'm thinking about the stoplight, the green, the yellow, and the red, right? So what are our greens, yellow, and reds in this space? And I would love for that to be a part of the accountability process as well.
I think something that's hard about ethics inside tech companies is it's very hard to make the business case for it. And these companies need to operate on the business case. So in that world, what are the levers for pressure? One lever is employee activism. Google Walkout's if we don't make the ethical decision, we're going to lose our workforce. That becomes a business case, right? Then you're like, oh, we need to retain our employees. We need to do good. And then I think the other way that the principles of capitalism could be used to enforce ethics is when companies are competing against each other for better ethics, which is why I'm such an advocate of algorithmic transparency, transparency of your assessments, the human rights assessments we were talking about earlier, transparency and data contributed to the government and how different companies are faring on safe practices for users. To me, that's the only way that capitalism actually does encourage companies to do the right thing internally so that they look better compared to their external.
Yes.
Other questions? We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
So 2-part, potentially, Dustin, repeat the name of the first quote that you shared.
Race After Technology, Ruha Benjamin. Race After Technology. Yep.
And second of all, I find often that when I'm talking to more technical people, it's really difficult to explain why the human side of things and the experiences are any advice for how to talk about that with people who seem to not instinctively understand that?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I tend to believe that having illustrative examples are really useful. So having that story, that narrative that really unpacks the problem of tech and its impact on society, but bringing it to not just having some statistic, but who is that person, who is that case, who is that user, and then hopefully articulating that in a way that pulls at their heartstrings has been really useful in the work that we've done in the Safe Lab.
I've spent a lot of time working as an engineer in industry, and the Kool-Aid is super strong. It's really strong. And a lot of your friends are at work, and so they're all drinking similar Kool-Aid. So you're not hearing the perspective that you're bringing to these conversations. I would say that bringing up the topic with people is forcing them to think about new viewpoints, and maybe their instinct is to be defensive because it feels like an attack on what they're choosing to do with their lives, which nobody wants that in a social setting, etc. But I think bringing up the topic is super important, and people are internalizing it more than they may let on through their cues in the conversation.
I also think there's a long game about bringing different voices to the table, and meaning like in elementary school, hi teacher, right, we're giving kids the tools to even get into the game, right? And so from my perspective, that's not necessarily code for all. It might be math and logic for all, right? And really strong literacy skills. And we know that in lots of parts of the US, we haven't even gotten there. And so from my perspective, the longer game, right, is how do you get different voices to be the engineers, and then also the folks who are around the engineers, the UX people and the content moderators and frankly the executives, so that there's a lot more voices at the table, right? Because there's more than one way to solve a problem.
So one of the things we're doing at Columbia Social Work, which is a part of what you're saying, is we created a new minor called Emerging Technology, Media, and Society. And the goal is to not create new data scientists, but to have social workers who could be at the table with technologists and data scientists, to have a literacy and a fluency of the language that's being said, but to be a social worker, just like a social worker would be in a medical team, to offer particular insights around blind spotting, around context, around community, that are equally as important to the design of the algorithm as well.
Thanks. We're getting the hook. We're out of time. Thank you for engaging in this conversation with us.